Hello class. This week we are looking at our objectives, which is the Age of Jackson. This is chapter 7.3. Our first objective this week is describe the tensions between Adams and Jackson and describe the expansion of suffrage. Suffrage means that more and more people in the US are voting because the population is spreading. The second thing is we are explaining Jackson's spoil system and his appeal on the common citizen. The last is that we're going to summarize the effects of the Indian Removal Act. Now, these three objectives are sort of what we're looking at in this one chapter. Your first question for the week, meaning the question you need to answer, is we have discussed Andrew Jackson before in the War of 1812. I would like you to tell me what was Jackson's role in War of 1812 and how does that reflect his new term in presidency. So to start the chapter off, we are looking at the deaths of two of America's first presidents. This is our second president, John Adams, and our third president, Jefferson. This sort of marks the end of an era. This is the independence era when America became a country. Now we have the rising era of Jackson. In 1824, we have Jackson ends up winning the popular vote, meaning most of the population vote for him, but he does not win the electoral vote. That means that the state representatives do not vote for him. Okay? He does not win that popularity. John Quincy Adams, who is John Adams' son, ends up being elected the president because he wins the electoral vote. He also has the support of someone in the Senate as well, Clay. Jacksonians, who are people who are loyal to Andrew Jackson, they basically start getting very angry about this and claim that Adams and Clay have sort of struck a corrupt bargain to gain national government. What is the outcome of this election? Jackson does not win. Adams ends up winning because he wins the electoral vote. But it becomes clear that because Clay, who is sort of a deciding factor in this, ends up becoming his vice president, many of the Jacksonians believe that there's sort of a corruption with this. They end up starting, as a result of this, the Democratic Republican Party. This is what we would see today as the modern-day Democrats. So my question for the map that is right on this screen is, this is your second question of today. Looking at this map, both the electoral vote and the popular vote, why would Jacksonians be upset about this election? The third reason why this election is important is because it starts to show the expanding rise of people voting. Now, people voting still does not include slaves, and it does not include women. It still only includes white men. But what this election shows is that there are more men voting. This is the idea of democracy is actually starting to play out. So we have most states, they ease up the qualifications for voting, okay? So before this, you had to have property to vote. You no longer have to have property, okay? So in 1928, numerous voters, because there are so many new voters included, they actually helped Jackson win the next presidency. Okay, so 4 years later, 4 have passed. Those 4 years before, we had John Quincy Adams as the president. Now we have another election. Again, this election is going to be Jackson versus John Quincy Adams. But because of those, the easing up of voting standards, meaning a lot more people can vote now, okay, Jackson does a very smart thing. And what he does is he appeals to the common citizen. What this means is that Jackson makes himself seem like he is like everyone else. Even though Jackson is actually quite rich and he is a plantation owner, that means he's sort of from the South, he makes it seem that he is from humble origins, that he sort of is not as not as rich as it seems. All right, now everyone pay attention to the map that is below me, okay? This is the map of 1828. I'm going to ask you another question. I would like you to compare the electoral vote versus the popular vote, and I want you to just discuss what are you seeing comparing these sort of images. So as we see on the last map, Jackson wins the next election by landslide. That means most people voted for Jackson. The reason is he's a very charismatic person. He's a very great personality. When Jackson gets into government, one of the first things that he does is he sort of limits the appointees to federal jobs to 4-year terms. Now what this means is basically he is taking out many of the people who are left over from John Quincy Adams' administration and putting in his own sort of Jacksonian loyal people. This is a little bit of a debate whether this was a good thing or not. He's sort of basically filling the government with people who like him and who are his friends, okay? He also, this is called the spoils system, okay? The other thing is that his primary advisors, they are also his friends. So if you can imagine, Jackson basically takes out any sort of opposition in government and puts in people who like him. Okay, and people who are going to agree with what he's doing. They call his primary advisors the kitchen cabinet, which means that they all escaped through the kitchen, through the back kitchen, not through the front door. 2 years into Jackson's presidency, so we're talking 1830, there is a law passed to deal with Native Americans. Okay, so we're sort of switching, we're focusing a little bit on what's happening with Native American groups at this time during Jackson. Now, we've already discussed that many people are moving west. Now, who's already there? Usually Native Americans are there, okay? There's sort of a debate on what you're supposed to do with the Native Americans. Many people wanted to try and assimilate Native Americans into white culture. This did and didn't work. They said that about 5 tribes started to adapt Western ways, but generally they still sort of kept a lot of their own culture. Jackson, who is the president at this time, he decides that the only way to deal with Native Americans is to kick Native Americans off their land. He believes that assimilation will not work. He also believes that it's going to take too many government resources to allow natives to stay in their land. So this is what they end up passing, what we call is the Indian Removal Act of 1813. And what this act does is it basically funds treaties, these are sort of like treaties made with Native American tribes, to force all of them to move westward. Now, if you remember, the West is not really settled yet by white people. So they basically think, well, the West is free and open for natives to go and settle and live there. This is not a very good way to deal with this. Basically, they are forcing people off their land. They're trying to give them money, but not a lot of money, and displace them in an area which they do not know how to survive, okay? So if we think of the Indian Removal Act of 1930, it's quite a horrible thing if you think about it. Now, many of the native tribes, they end up removing themselves from their original land. But one example, we're going to be focusing on the Cherokee tribe. The Cherokee tribe is not going to leave their land so easily. They decide to fight back. And the way that they do this is they sort of take it to the federal government and the Supreme Court. Okay, so this is the legislative branch, judicial branch. What they end up doing is they have no standing in the federal government because they are not even really recognized as people. Okay, they have no rights in American government system. So what the Cherokee does is they actually find an American citizen who was a Christian missionary who helped the Cherokee. And together with this missionary, they have another Supreme Court case called Worcester versus Georgia State. They basically are trying to rule that the state cannot rule or invade Cherokee land. This does not work, even though they're trying. And part of the reason it doesn't work is because Jackson is basically very strict in saying that the Supreme Court had already ruled against Cherokee, and they are now going to force the Cherokee to be removed from their land. They keep on sort of fighting this over and over again, but eventually in 1838, we have only 20,000 Cherokee remaining in this area, and eventually they're even ordered to leave, okay? This leads to probably one of the worst events in American history. This is called the Trail of Tears. So those last 20,000 Cherokee that are sort of trying to stay on their land, they are basically forced off their land, and they are supposed to make an 800-mile trip on foot. So imagine that you have to walk 800 miles. That would be the equivalent of probably around over 2,000 kilometers by walking, okay? Now on this trip, many Cherokee are dying from sickness. They are being robbed by the government themselves. So government officials who accompany them are robbing the people. We have robbers or outlaws, as we call them, are just robbing them on the road. And we just have thousands of people dying. So imagine if you had a family with 3 children and your wife, and you have to walk 800 miles with a crying baby, with not proper food, no proper place to sleep. This is the sort of thing that the Cherokee tribe had to deal with. So if you're to look at the image below me, you are seeing sort of a map of how the Trail of Tears happened. In the red lines, the red arrows, that is the specific Trail of Tears. But we have a lot of different Indian removals as well. So that's all showing all the black lines. All the yellow areas, that is the land that government sort of took away from Native Americans. And the red area, that is where they're moving them. So they're moving many different tribes all together in one area. Now, for your last question today, I'm going to have you answer, do you think that the Trail of Tears, was this a sort of proper way or a good way to deal with Native Americans in America? Make sure you use examples and tell me why you think so or why you do not think so.